Part 1, Question 3, Article 1, whether God is a body. After his 5 proofs of God's existence, St. Thomas moves on to what we can say about God. Is God just a bigger, better version of ourselves, something like Zeus or Poseidon or Thor, or take your pick? Or is God something utterly different than these pagan lowercase g gods? And one thing you might be thinking about is Christian art. That's worth thinking about. You gotta draw something after all. So if we're going to think about Christian art and representations of God, let's dive in to what St. Thomas was developing as the philosophy of Christendom, and his authority is St. John. God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So right from the start, Thomas connects our knowledge of God with worship. They are always connected. Olympians, like Zeus and Poseidon, they are happy with material sacrifices. Let's check the register. How many cows were sacrificed this month? The true God must be worshipped, according to St. John, in spirit and truth. But Scripture calls God, quote, higher than heaven, deeper than hell, wider than the sea. How are we to interpret these passages? Objection 2. Scripture also says that man is created in the image of God. Well, man is a body. Doesn't that mean that God has a body also? Other objections. The Bible talks about God's arm, his eyes, his hands. It mentions him, and these are pronouns. That would suggest something. Scripture mentions God sitting or standing. It mentions going to God or going away from God. All that implies that God has a location. Thomas offers 3 proofs, then, that God is not a body, and these link directly back to his 5 proofs of God's existence. The first here hinges on God, the unmoved first mover. Bodies are moved. The second proof, not about movement, but about causes. This should remind you of the 5 ways. Anyway, causes. God must be pure act, no potential. And Thomas will come back to this understanding of God as pure act again and again and again. So it's worth dilating on this for just one moment. Change, following Aristotle, involves moving from potential to actual. A pile of lumber is a potential house. A pile of lumber is also a potential fire. It needs an architect to become an actual house. It needs a flame to become an actual fire. Left alone, it will remain just a pile of lumber. God, however, is absolutely first. He can require no pre-existing knowledge of building, no pre-existing flame to become what God is. God is pure act, no potential. Proof number 3. God is infinitely perfect, but an animate body requires a soul. The soul is more perfect than the body. We're getting back to worship here. God is infinitely perfect. He has no lesser parts, and that would be the case if God had a literal arm or an eye or a hand. You couldn't point to God's hand and say it was perfect if it was less perfect than God's soul. Later we'll be dilating on the simplicity of God. Reply to objection 1. Physical language is used as an analogy, and Thomas gives examples. By depth, the Bible signifies God's power of knowing hidden things. By height, his transcendence or his excelling power. By length, the Bible speaks of the duration of his existence. And by breadth, his act of love for all. And I love this fact that Thomas then cites other possible interpretations of these passages. Reply to objection 2. Image here means reason, the rational animal, not physical shape, as the manner in which man is made in the image of God. Other objections, God's members and his postures and his locations, again, the analogy to location, signify, quote, that we draw near to God not by corporal steps, since he is everywhere, but by the affections of our soul, i.e., spiritual actions. Thomas thus begins the question of God's simplicity by making a hard and fast distinction between how God must be worshipped spiritually with how we are forced to talk about God by using physical analogies, which brings us back to Christian art. And one pet peeve that I have. The Sistine Chapel is sophisticated. Can we say that? And it came out of a sophisticated theology, not out of a simplistic view of God as some powerful man with a beard. So no, God is not a body.